There's a state where every taxpayer would need to write a personal check for $44,500 just to settle the state's existing bills, where the gap between what the state owes and what it has in the bank reached $61.8 billion, where the unfunded pension liability sits at 147.6% of own-source revenue, and where the local conversation continues to celebrate a rainy day fund of $4.1 billion as if that solves anything. The state is Connecticut, and it's not even the worst on this list. While everyone's been told the state economy is doing fine, the actual balance sheets of state governments have been quietly bleeding for a decade. Not because tax revenue collapsed, because the promises made to public workers, retirees, and bondholders have grown faster than the revenue that funds them. According to Truth in Accounting's 2025 Financial State of the States report, 25 American states do not have enough money to pay their bills. According to the same report, the 50 states collectively hold $2.2 trillion in assets against $2.9 trillion in debt, leaving a $765 billion structural shortfall. According to Reason Foundation's 2024 Annual Pension Solvency Report, 47 of the 50 states carry public pension debt, with 36 states owing more than $5 billion each. According to the Pew Charitable Trusts, the reported funding gap for state pension plans nationwide reached $1.32 trillion in 2023, and unfunded pension obligations alone account for $832 billion of the total state shortfall. In this countdown, we're exposing 10 states that are quietly insolvent in 2026. Not the cliché version where every state is technically broke. The real one. The version where specific state balance sheets show negative net positions, where pension systems are funded below 60%, where the gap between promises and assets has grown for over a decade, and where the local press still describes the budget as balanced, because the politicians legally said it was. One state on this list has a per-taxpayer burden of $44,500. Another has the second highest per capita pension debt in America. A third has the worst funded pension plan of any major state in the country, with a key system below 50%. Think about it. You probably haven't read your state's audited financial report. You probably trust that the budget your governor signed is actually balanced. You probably haven't connected your property tax bill to the unfunded pension liability that drives it. Subscribe before your state's next ratings downgrade. Like the video if you've ever wondered why your taxes keep climbing while the services keep thinning. Let's break it down. Number 10. New Mexico, the land of enchantment, where the enchantment is wearing off the balance sheet alongside the wage structure. There's a state where every taxpayer carries a $7,800 burden in unpaid state bills, where the public pension system is funded at roughly 66%, where pension debt per capita reaches $8,641, and where the state's narrow economic base limits the capacity to absorb the shortfall through standard revenue increases. Welcome to New Mexico. New Mexico is the state with significant federal employment at Los Alamos and Sandia, a strong arts and tourism economy, and a balance sheet quietly underwater for over a decade. The numbers. New Mexico carries a taxpayer burden of $7,800 per resident, according to Truth in Accounting's 2025 Financial State of the States report. New Mexico public pension system is funded at approximately 66% per Reason Foundation analysis. New Mexico pension debt per capita reaches $8,641, among the top 10 in America. New Mexico's tax structure relies heavily on oil and gas severance taxes, creating revenue volatility that complicates pension funding. New Mexico net domestic migration was negative 10,526 in the year ending July 2025, shrinking the future tax base. What it's like. Living in New Mexico is like dating someone artistic and interesting whose bank statements you've never been allowed to see, and now you understand why. Picture this. You're a 41-year-old in Santa Fe in 2026. Your property tax bill arrived in March. Your state employee neighbor mentions the pension reforms are working. The local newspaper celebrates a budget surplus. You read the audited financial report on a Saturday and discover the state actually has a $5 billion structural shortfall. The numbers in the newspaper and the numbers in the financial report do not match, where it gets uncomfortable. New Mexico's structural problem is the gap between the cash budget the legislature passes and the accrual balance sheet the auditors produce. The cash budget can look balanced. The accrual balance sheet shows the unfunded pension liability growing year over year. The two documents tell very different stories. The cash version is what voters read. The accrual version is what eventually arrives. Sharp contrast. New Mexico and Texas are neighboring states. Texas has stronger economic diversification and a lower taxpayer burden of $1,100. New Mexico's narrower base produces a $7,800 burden. Same region, very different fiscal capacity. Number 9, Alabama, the Yellowhammer state, where the budget looks fine on paper and the balance sheet tells the opposite story. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $8,000 burden, where the pension system is funded at approximately 66%, where the available assets cover only about 65% of total bills, and where the structural shortfall has compounded for a decade while the official budget kept getting described as balanced. Welcome to Alabama. Alabama is the state with one of the most extensively documented gaps between official budget rhetoric and audited balance sheet reality. The numbers. Alabama carries a taxpayer burden of $8,000 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. Alabama had $21.9 billion available to pay $33.4 billion worth of bills, leaving a structural gap of $11.5 billion. Alabama pension system is funded at approximately 66% per Reason Foundation 2024. Alabama home insurance averages $4,082, the seventh highest in America per Insurify, adding household cost pressure on top of state-level fiscal pressure. Alabama has not expanded Medicaid, leaving the federal-state partnership on healthcare uncompensated care more limited than in expansion states. What it's like. Living in Alabama is like dating someone who insists they're financially fine while quietly running up a T. Their friends are starting to notice. Picture this. You're a 54-year-old in Birmingham in 2026. Your state legislator tells you the budget is balanced. The audited financial report tells you the state is short $11.5 billion. You don't know which one to believe. You ask the local newspaper. You're starting to suspect that balanced and solvent are not the same thing. Where it gets uncomfortable. Alabama's structural problem is that the state has been running cash-basis budgets that legally clear the balanced budget requirement, while the accrual-basis balance sheet shows a growing shortfall. The reform conversation continues to focus on the cash budget. The accrual gap continues to grow. Sharp contrast. Alabama and Tennessee are direct neighbors. Tennessee carries a taxpayer surplus of $10,900, the fifth best in America per TIA 2025. Alabama carries a burden of $8,000. Same region, very different fiscal management. Number 8, South Carolina. The Palmetto State where the inbound migration tells one story and the balance sheet tells another. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $8,100 burden, where the public pension system is in distressed status with a funded ratio of 59.9%, where the state has implemented multiple pension reforms since 2012 with incremental improvement at best, and where the strong population growth has not translated to corresponding fiscal stabilization. Welcome to South Carolina. South Carolina is the state with one of the strongest economic growth trajectories in America, and one of the most persistent structural fiscal challenges. The numbers. South Carolina carries a taxpayer burden of $8,100 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. South Carolina public pension system is funded at approximately 59.9% in distressed status per Equitable Institute. South Carolina pension contribution rates for state employees have climbed substantially over the past decade. South Carolina's strong population growth has expanded the tax base, but not enough to close the structural pension shortfall. South Carolina coastal home insurance climbed roughly 60% between 2022 and 2025, adding household cost pressure on top of fiscal pressure. What it's like. Living in South Carolina is like dating someone who keeps insisting they're doing better than ever while their credit card bills tell a different story. Picture this. You're a 47-year-old recent transplant in Charleston in 2026. You moved from New Jersey to escape the property tax. Your South Carolina property tax is lower. Your state taxpayer burden is also significant. Your homeowner's insurance climbed 60% in 3 years. You're starting to understand you traded one fiscal pressure for another, where it gets uncomfortable. South Carolina's structural problem is that the state's growth has been absorbed by other spending priorities, while the pension obligation has continued to compound. The reforms have been substantial. The funded ratio improvements have been incremental. The political conversation continues to balance growth investment against fiscal repair. Sharp contrast. South Carolina and North Carolina are direct neighbors with similar growth profiles. North Carolina's pension system is funded at approximately 87%, significantly stronger. South Carolina's pension is funded at 59.9% in distressed territory. Same coast, very different fiscal trajectories. Hey, before we get into the top 7, the states we're about to cover are the ones where the structural fiscal shortfall has been most aggressively documented, where the audited balance sheets diverge most sharply from the official budget narratives, and where the cumulative impact on residents has shown up in everything from property tax bills to bank branch closures to outmigration. If this list has been useful, hit subscribe because the next one we're working on is 10 American cities where the property tax bill just doubled, and you'll want the names. Like the video if you've ever wondered why your state taxes keep climbing while the services keep thinning. Drop a comment if you live in one of these 10 states or are considering leaving one. Now let's keep going. Number 7. Rhode Island, the ocean state, where the smallest state in the lower 48 carries one of the largest per taxpayer burdens, which takes a certain kind of effort. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $8,500 burden, where pension obligations have compounded against a small economic base, where the median home price separated from the local wage structure years ago, and where the regional Northeast fiscal pressure has hit Rhode Island as hard as states 20 times its size. Welcome to Rhode Island. Rhode Island is the smallest state in America by land area, with a population of roughly 1.1 million and a balance sheet that has been underwater for most of the past decade. The numbers. Rhode Island carries a taxpayer burden of $8,500 per resident, per Truth in Accounting 2025. Rhode Island pension system carries significant unfunded liabilities that the state has been addressing through reform efforts since 2011. Rhode Island net domestic migration was negative 1,551 in the year ending July 2025, shrinking the future tax base. Rhode Island median home prices have climbed past $450,000, separating the housing market from the local wage structure. Rhode Island property tax burdens rank among the highest in New England. What it's like. Living in Rhode Island is like dating someone with charming quirks, great seafood, and a budget situation that has been quietly worsening for years while everyone pretends not to notice. Picture this. You're a 38-year-old teacher in Providence in 2026. Your salary is fine. Your rent is $2,400. Your property tax bill on the home you've been considering would consume nearly $8,000 a year. You're starting to run the numbers on Raleigh. You're not the first. Where it gets uncomfortable. Rhode Island's structural problem is that the state's small economic base produces less revenue elasticity than larger states with similar pension obligations. The reforms have been substantial. The economic capacity to absorb the obligations remains limited. The result is sustained outflow of working-age residents to lower burden states. Sharp contrast. Rhode Island and New Hampshire are both small New England states. New Hampshire has no state income tax and a taxpayer burden under $700. Rhode Island carries an $8,500 burden. Same region, very different fiscal frameworks. Number 6, Pennsylvania, the Keystone state that just lost the Keystone with a $9,400 taxpayer burden and a net domestic migration loss of 30,718 residents in a single year. There's a state where every taxpayer carries a $9,400 burden, where bank branches declined 9.8% relative to 2019, where Philadelphia has continued to lose residents, and where the broader Northeast fiscal outflow has hit Pennsylvania as hard as any state on the list. Welcome to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the state at the geographic center of the Northeast fiscal restructuring story, with pension obligations, infrastructure aging, and demographic decline, all compounding against revenue growth that has not kept pace. The numbers. Pennsylvania carries a taxpayer burden of $9,400 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. Pennsylvania pension system is funded at approximately 66% per Reason Foundation 2024. Pennsylvania net domestic migration was negative 30,718 in the year ending July 2025, per Census Bureau, Vintage 2025 estimates. Pennsylvania bank branches declined 9.8% relative to 2019, among the 5 steepest in America per the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania median home price has climbed past $290,000, with Philadelphia Metro significantly higher. What it's like. Living in Pennsylvania is like dating someone with a great history, an interesting personality, and a credit report that keeps quietly worsening every year. Picture this. You're a 49-year-old in suburban Pittsburgh in 2026. Your home value is steady. Your property tax has climbed. Your kids move to Charlotte and Nashville for work. Your retired friends keep moving to Florida. Your spouse mentions the state budget situation on the way home from work. You're starting to plan retirement somewhere else, where it gets uncomfortable. Pennsylvania's structural problem is the combination of rural decline, urban cost prise, sure, and the broader Northeast fiscal pattern compressing in parallel. The rural counties have lost population for over a decade. The pension obligations have continued to grow. The bank branches have closed in the communities least able to absorb the loss. Sharp contrast. Pennsylvania and Ohio are both Rust Belt states with structural fiscal challenges. Ohio carries a burden of $1,300, significantly lower. Pennsylvania's burden of $9,400 is 7 times higher per taxpayer. Same region, very different fiscal management trajectories. Number 5. Maryland. The free state where federal employment was supposed to be the permanent fiscal anchor, and the balance sheet keeps disagreeing. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $11,100 burden, where federal workforce reductions have rippled through the local tax base, where pension obligations have compounded against limited revenue diversification, and where the state's proximity to Washington has not insulated the balance sheet. Welcome to Maryland. Maryland is the state most non-Marylanders think of when driving from Pennsylvania to D.C., and the state's economy has been quietly tied to federal employment for longer than most residents realize. The numbers. Maryland carries a taxpayer burden of $11,100 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. Maryland has approximately 145,000 federal civilian employees, the third highest concentration in America after the District of Columbia and Virginia. Maryland property tax burdens rank among the top 10 in the nation. Maryland pension system has been working through reform measures with incremental funded ratio improvements. Maryland net domestic migration was negative 8,525 in the year ending July 2025, per Census Bureau, Vintage 2025 estimates. What it's like. Living in Maryland is like dating someone whose entire identity was tied to working at one employer that just announced a reorganization, and the credit card bills are starting to show it. Picture this. You're a 45-year-old federal contractor in suburban Maryland in 2026. Your contract has been reduced. Your kid's school district is fine, but the cost of living isn't. Your property tax bill arrived in March. You're running the numbers on Pennsylvania, just an hour north. You're not packing yet, but you're researching. You've started reading the audited state financial report on weekends, where it gets uncomfortable. Maryland's structural problem is the unique combination of federal employment dependency and high cost of living that compresses household budgets while the state balance sheet is also under pressure. The reforms have been substantial. The structural conditions have continued to compound. Sharp contrast. Maryland and Virginia are neighboring states with similar federal dependence. Virginia's taxpayer burden is significantly lower at roughly $1,500. Maryland's is $11,100, more than 7 times higher per taxpayer. Same region, very different post-2024 fiscal trajectories. Number 4. Kentucky. The bluegrass state where the pension system has been one of the most extensively documented fiscal disasters in modern American state government. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $11,500 burden, where the Kentucky Employees Retirement System non-hazardous plan was funded below 20% in 2018 and required asset allocation changes to maintain liquidity, where pension debt per capita reaches $8,626, and where multiple reform measures since 2017 have produced incremental but not transformative improvement. Welcome to Kentucky. Kentucky is the state with one of the most distressed individual pension plans in America, where the structural pension underfunding has compounded for decades. The numbers. Kentucky carries a taxpayer burden of $11,500 per resident, per Truth in Accounting 2025. Kentucky public pension system is funded at approximately 50.1% per Equitable Institute analysis. Kentucky Employees Retirement System non-hazardous plan was funded below 20% in 2018, with the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority reducing the investment return assumption to 5.25%. Kentucky pension debt per capita reaches $8,626 per resident. Kentucky has implemented multiple pension reform measures since 2017, with limited improvement in the structural funding gap. Reddit quote: Kentucky is the state where the state employee pension was funded below 20%, and they tried to fix it by lowering the assumed rate of return, which is a creative way to admit the math never worked. What it's like. Living in Kentucky is like dating someone with a great heart, real character, and a retirement account they've been quietly drawing down for years. Picture this. You're a 58-year-old state employee in Frankfurt in 2026. You've been contributing to the pension for 30 years. The state legislature has been reforming the plan for the past decade. Your retirement benefits have been adjusted multiple times. You're not certain what your actual retirement income will be. You're starting to research private retirement options to supplement, where it gets uncomfortable. Kentucky's structural problem is that the state has been making promises to public workers that the funding could not sustain. The reform efforts have been substantial. The KERS non-hazardous plan being forced to maintain unusually low-risk asset allocations to preserve liquidity for current benefit payments is documented and unprecedented. The structural challenge of funding promises made during decades of less aggressive contribution requirements remains substantial. Sharp contrast. Kentucky and Tennessee are direct neighbors. Tennessee's pension system is funded at 104%, the strongest in America. Kentucky's is funded at 50.1%, among the worst. Same region, completely different fiscal outcomes. Number 3. Vermont. The Green Mountain State, where the small population disguises one of the largest per-taxpayer fiscal burdens in America. There's a state where every taxpayer carries a $12,500 burden, where property tax burdens rank among the highest in the nation, where the small economic base limits revenue elasticity, and where the structural pension obligations have compressed alongside the broader Northeast fiscal pattern. Welcome to Vermont. Vermont is the state with the smallest population in New England by margin, with roughly 647,000 residents and a balance sheet that has been underwater for years. The numbers. Vermont carries a taxpayer burden of $12,500 per resident, per Truth in Accounting 2025. Vermont property tax burden is approximately 5.12% effective rate, the third highest in America per Tax Foundation 2025. Vermont median household income sits roughly in the middle of national rankings. Vermont pension system has been working through structural reform measures with incremental progress. Vermont's small economic base provides limited revenue elasticity to absorb structural obligations. What it's like. Living in Vermont is like dating someone earnest, beautiful, surrounded by forests, and quietly maxing out their credit cards to maintain the lifestyle. Picture this. You're a 52-year-old in Burlington in 2026. Your property tax on a $400,000 home is over $20,000 a year. Your salary is fine but not high enough to absorb the tax without compression elsewhere. Your kids' college bills are due. Your retired neighbors moved to Florida last year. Where it gets uncomfortable. Vermont's structural problem is that the state's lifestyle premium, the rural beauty, and the strong public services has been funded by tax structures that are unsustainable against the small economic base. The reforms have been substantial. The structural conditions have continued to compound. Sharp contrast. Vermont and New Hampshire are direct neighbors. New Hampshire has no state income tax and a per-taxpayer burden under $700. Vermont carries a $12,500 burden, nearly 18 times higher per taxpayer. Same region, very different fiscal frameworks. Number 2. Delaware. The first state that became one of the worst-positioned states in America on a per-taxpayer basis, despite being the legal home of half the Fortune 500. There's a state where every taxpayer carries a $15,700 burden, where 64 bank branches closed in the first quarter of 2026 alone, where the corporate banking sector thrives while consumer banking deserts expand, and where the gap between the Delaware that Wall Street uses and the Delaware that residents live in has widened to absurd proportions. Welcome to Delaware. Delaware is the state most non-Delawareans think of as a corporate registration capital and a tax haven for legal entities, while the actual residents carry one of the largest fiscal burdens in America. The numbers. Delaware carries a taxpayer burden of $15,700 per resident, per Truth in Accounting, 2025. Delaware had 64 bank branch closures in the first quarter of 2026, the most of any state in America despite its tiny size, per OCC filings. Delaware maintains AAA credit ratings from the major rating agencies despite the taxpayer burden due to legal entity revenue. Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey combined lost 627 branches in a single Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia study period. Delaware's banking deserts expanded fastest in lower-income and non-white communities, per Fed research. Reddit quote, Delaware is the state where the credit card capital of America carries a $15,700 fiscal burden per resident, and the corporate banking has nothing to do with the consumer reality, what it's like. Living in Delaware is like dating someone with prestigious connections, an impressive resume, and a personal finance situation that doesn't match the public image at all. Picture this. You're a 49-year-old in suburban Delaware in 2026. Your state hosts more Fortune 500 legal homes than any other state in America. Your state also has the most bank branch closures of any state in America in 2026. You're starting to understand that Delaware means two very different things, and you live in the wrong one, where it gets uncomfortable. Delaware's structural problem is the most extreme illustration of the gap between corporate-facing prosperity and consumer-facing fiscal stress in America. The corporate side is booming. The consumer side is carrying a $15,700 per taxpayer burden. The two coexist within the same state because they involve almost entirely different financial systems. Sharp contrast. Delaware and Maryland are neighbors with similar regional profiles. Maryland's burden is $11,100, lower than Delaware's $15,700. Delaware's smaller population concentrates the per-taxpayer mathematics. Same region, very different per capita fiscal load. Number 1. Connecticut. The Constitution state where the Constitution apparently doesn't include affordable solvency, and the per-taxpayer burden tops the national list at $44,500. There's a state where every taxpayer carries a $44,500 burden, tied with New Jersey for the worst in America, where the structural shortfall reached $61.8 billion in FY 2024, where the pension system is funded at approximately 57.8%, with $37 billion in unfunded liability, representing 147.6% of own source revenue, and where the state's fiscal guardrails since 2017 have produced measurable progress that the magnitude of the historic shortfall continues to dwarf. Welcome to Connecticut. Connecticut is the state with the most extensively documented sinkhole status in modern American state government, where the gap between the prosperous Connecticut of Greenwich and Fairfield County and the structural fiscal Connecticut of the state balance sheet has reached unprecedented proportions. The numbers. Connecticut carries a taxpayer burden of $44,500 per resident, tied with New Jersey for the worst in America, per Truth in Accounting 2025. Connecticut received an F grade and ranked 49th of 50 states in TIA 2025. Connecticut's structural shortfall reached $61.8 billion at the close of FY 2024. Connecticut pension debt per capita reaches $10,151, the second highest in America after Illinois, per Reason Foundation 2024. Connecticut pension unfunded liability of approximately $37 billion represents 147.6% of own source revenue. Connecticut implemented fiscal guardrail policies in 2017 to direct revenue surpluses toward pension debt reduction. Connecticut net domestic migration was negative 17,224 in the year ending July 2025, per Census Bureau, Vintage 2025 estimates. What it's like. Living in Connecticut is like dating someone with old money, very specific tastes, an ever-growing tab, and a habit of insisting the rainy day fund means everything is under control while the actual debt keeps climbing. Picture this. You're a 51-year-old finance professional in Fairfield County in 2026. Your home value is up. Your property tax bill is up faster. Your firm has been hiring more aggressively in Florida. Your boss bought a place in Palm Beach. The state legislature celebrated the $4.1 billion rainy day fund last year, while the audited balance sheet showed a $61.8 billion shortfall. You read the audit on a Saturday. You called your accountant on Monday. You're 18 months from making the decision. Where it gets uncomfortable. Connecticut's structural problem is that the state's fiscal guardrails since 2017 have produced measurable absolute reduction, but the magnitude of the historic shortfall has continued to overwhelm the pace of reform. The reforms have been substantial. The reform progress has been documented. The $61.8 billion gap has not been closed by an order of magnitude in 8 years of guardrails, and the structural conditions that produce the gap remain in place. Sharp contrast. Connecticut and New Hampshire are New England neighbors with very different fiscal profiles. New Hampshire's taxpayer burden is under $700. Connecticut's is $44,500, more than 60 times higher per taxpayer. Same region, completely opposite balance sheets. So there it is. 10 states that are quietly insolvent in 2026, on the public record, in Truth in Accounting's Financial State of the States 2025 report, in Reason Foundation's Annual Pension Solvency Report, in Equitable Institute funded ratio rankings, in state-by-state audited financial reports. States where the audited balance sheet diverges sharply from the official budget narrative. States where unfunded pension obligations have compounded for decades. States where the structural shortfall has crowded out other state spending priorities. States where the per-taxpayer mathematics shows what the cash budget rhetoric obscures. States where the bondholders, the public workers, and the future taxpayers are absorbing the consequences of decisions made decades before the current crisis became visible. The American states with sound balance sheets in 2026 are places like North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, Utah, and Tennessee, with per-taxpayer surpluses ranging from $10,900 in Tennessee to $63,000 in North Dakota. They are winning because they have specific revenue policies, governance structures, and pension management approaches that have allowed their balance sheets to remain in surplus. The 10 states on this list have made different choices, and the consequences are showing up on the per-taxpayer balance sheet. The good news? You can know this. Truth in Accounting publishes the financial state of the Balsio States Report annually for free. The Reason Foundation publishes the annual Pension Solvency Report for free. The Equitable Institute publishes funded ratio rankings for free. The audited state financial reports are public. You can read them. Most people don't. Most people trust that balanced budget means solvent and never connect the property tax bill to the unfunded pension liability that drives it. The reason these 10 states are quietly insolvent is that the math of state government has been getting harder for over a decade. The pension contributions fell behind the obligations. The bond payments grew with interest rates. The federal aid arrived during COVID and is now declining. And the audited balance sheets, which most residents never read, have shown the gap growing year over year. If this list helped, share it with the friend who keeps insisting their state's budget is fine. Hit subscribe because next we're breaking down 10 American cities where the property tax bill just doubled, and you'll want to see if your city is on the list. Drop a comment if you live in one of these 10 states or are considering leaving one. And remember, the worst fiscal crisis isn't the loud one with the bond downgrade headlines. It's the quiet one where the audited balance sheet shows a $61.8 billion gap, the official budget gets called balanced, and the per-taxpayer burden quietly hits $44,500, while the local press celebrates the rainy day fund.